Hey everyone, today we are going to do the lesson for Civil Rights Part 1. The warm up is really an in class activity, so I'm going to skip it for the purposes of this video. You don't have to make it up if you're absent. So today, after the warm up, we're going to do some notes and then a Little Rock 9 activity followed by an exit ticket. And the exit ticket relates to this essential question: how successful was the civil rights movement in obtaining equality for African American people? Here are some quotes that I'd like you to just analyze to yourself. What is your initial reaction to these quotes? We have We've talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write it in the books of the law, by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Remember, in the previous lesson, we talked about Lyndon B. Johnson. And from Martin Luther King, we have, I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the brick daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. I'd really like to have this be an open discussion about your initial reactions, so I'm not going to give any thoughts at this time. We'll discuss in class. Our key concept today is to discuss how the civil rights movement evolved during the 1950s and 60s, and to explain each of the three developments of protests, Warren Court, and Johnson presidency. We'll get into some more details with these. Oops. For African American people, the path from being enslaved to full civil rights was long and difficult. What were some of the challenges that they faced over time? The dangers of the system of sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, lynching, segregation, discrimination. Those are some examples that you could throw out there. Several developments during the 1950s and 60s legally guaranteed them full citizenship. Some of the ones we'll talk about today are the Montgomery bus boycott and sit-ins, the 24th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as Brown versus the Board of Education. The civil rights movement was a political, legal, and social struggle to gain full citizenship rights for African American people. What rights does this group of people still not have during this time period? They don't have still complete right to voting access because there's so much discrimination going on that is intended to terrorize people and turn them away from voting. We also still see segregation, which limits their access to equitable resources and just equitable enjoyment and entertainment within society. Those are a few examples. So education, of course, goes along with that segregation as well, equal access to education. The civil rights movement was first and foremost a challenge to segregation, the systems of laws and customs separating African American people and white people. During the movement, individuals and citizens and civil rights organizations challenged segregation and discrimination with a variety of activities, including protests, marches, boycotts, and refusal to abide by segregation laws. Segregation was an attempt by many white Southerners to separate the races in every aspect of daily life. What is the motivation here? Why did some people want segregation? Some people, unfortunately, truly believed that one race was superior to another race and wanted to enforce that within their society. Segregation was often called the Jim Crow system, after a minstrel show character from the 1830s who was an enslaved person who embodied negative stereotypes of African American people. Here are some advertisements. Jim Crow must go. Jim Crow blights the lives of Negro and white Americans alike, for prejudice corrupts. What are some examples of other forms of discrimination under the Jim Crow system? So we have the KKK thrived under the Jim Crow system. We just talked about segregation. So how would that spill into other aspects of society? We have education that deeply impacts, as well as higher education levels, not only just elementary, middle, high, but colleges as well. It can impact employment, and it can impact where people can live. Those are some examples. Segregation became common in southern states following the end of Reconstruction. What was Reconstruction? That was the process of rebuilding a united country after the Civil War in 1877. These states began to pass local and state laws that specified certain places for whites only and others for, quote, colored. Here is a photo of a drinking fountain on the county courthouse lawn of Halifax, North Carolina, labeled colored. African American people had separate schools, transportation, restaurants, and parks, many of which were poorly funded and inferior to those of white people. Over the next 75 years, Jim Crow signs to separate the races went up in every possible place. What was the court case that legalized segregation? Historian and socialist W.E.B. Du Bois was a founder and leader of the NAACP. Starting in 1910, he made powerful arguments protesting segregation as editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. What is the NAACP? It's the National Association, I forget the second A, for colored people. It's about promoting the rights of African American people. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that's what it is. It became one of the most prominent and important African American organizations of the 20th century. It relied mainly on legal strategies that challenged segregation and discrimination in the courts. Interestingly, Barack Obama became president 100 years after the founding of the NAACP. Obama was a significant figure to many people. Why? He was the first president of color to sit in the White House. Who are some influential people of color throughout history who you found inspiring? This is an opinion question, so I will leave that discussion for class. Here are some NAACP leaders. Which of these names do you recognize and what can you tell us about them? We have Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, who led the bus boycotts, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Claudette Colvin. We will discuss each of them on these slides. After World War II, the NAACP's campaign for civil rights continued to proceed. It was led by Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and challenged and overturned many forms of discrimination. Have you heard his name, Thurgood Marshall, before? Many have, but might not know details about what he has done. The main focus of the NAACP turned to equal educational opportunities. Marshall and the Defense Fund worked with Southern plaintiffs to challenge the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the decision that legalized segregation. They argued that separate was inherently unequal. What would that mean? So the original Plessy versus Ferguson decision stated that it was okay to have separate facilities as long as they were equal to one another. So you could have a water fountain. Let's keep it a simple example. A water fountain designated for people of color and a water fountain designated for white people. And as long as they looked exactly the same, that would be fine. You could separate in that way. But of course, we know that even that was inherently wrong, but they were not treated equally. Perhaps one fountain was leaky and never got repaired. One fountain was never cleaned, whereas the other was regularly repaired and maintained. The Supreme Court of the United States heard arguments on 5 cases that challenged elementary and secondary school education. They did this through nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, and legal action. What is civil disobedience? That would be breaking the law on purpose in order to draw attention to its unfairness. What are some examples of civil rights movements that you already know? We've talked about a few today. You might know, for example, the Montgomery bus boycotts started by Rosa Parks. So we have boycotts during this time, which would be refusing to buy goods or services from a business in order to force it to change its policies. Hunger strikes would be refusing to eat in order to get attention for your cause. Petitions would be writing to ask the government of a company to change its policy and then getting as many people to sign it as possible. Marches and demonstrations would involve getting a large group to gather in one place to bring attention to your cause. And strikes would include refusing to work in order to force your managers or government to change their policies. Have you all ever participated in nonviolent protests and would like to share your experiences? We'll talk about that in class. Civil disobedience is breaking the law or causing a disturbance in order to get attention for your cause. Sit-ins would occur when the protesters come into a place, sit down, and refuse to move. Do you think that nonviolent protests are typically successful? Why or why not? Probably a lot more of these were shut down and killed, the protest movement at a specific restaurant and things like that, than were successful. It took many of these together in the same era at the same time to truly make an impactful change. Lawyers can challenge a law or policy in court. If they convince the judge that the law or policy is unconstitutional, then the judge will order them to change. What are some examples of laws that have been determined unconstitutional? We will discuss some of those in class as well. Well, of course, for example, we'll come to this one, but Brown versus Board will overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. We'll have a slide on that soon. People can speak at government hearings or meetings and try to convince legislatures to make new laws or repeal unfair ones. In May 1954, the Warren Court issued its landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, stating racially segregated education was unconstitutional and overturning the Plessy decision. White Southerners were shocked by the Brown decision. Do you think that school segregation will end immediately, though? Unfortunately, it will not. It's going to take years for segregation to completely end. How equal are opportunities in schools today for people of any background to have fair chances of graduating or obtaining knowledge? We'll have a discussion about this in class. By 1955, white opposition in the South had grown into massive resistance, using a strategy to persuade all white people to resist compliance with desegregation orders. Tactics included firing school employees who showed willingness to seek integration, closing public schools rather than desegregating, and boycotting all public education that was integrated. Who knows the name of one of the first young Black children to attend a previously all-white school? That'll be Ruby Bridges, or you might cite some of the Little Rock Nine, which we'll talk about on this slide. Virtually no schools in the South desegregated their schools in the first years following the Brown decision. How'd they get away with this? It was very lightly enforced. There was also legislation saying that this should happen as soon as possible, which could be pretty vague. In Virginia, one county actually closed its public schools to prevent enforcing this. In 1957, Governor Orville Faubus defied a federal court order to admit 9 African American students to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Dwight Eisenhower sent federal troops to enforce the desegregation at that school. The event was covered by the national media, and the fate of the 9 students attempting to integrate the school gripped the nation. Not all school desegregation was as dramatic as Little Rock schools gradually desegregated. Often, schools were desegregated only in theory because racially segregated neighborhoods led to segregated schools. To overcome the problem, some school districts began busing their students to schools outside their neighborhoods in the 1970s. This actually happened in the CMS district. The Riverside Unified School District was the first district in the nation to voluntarily desegregate its schools. Why is school desegregation particularly important to people as compared to other areas that need desegregation? Access to education is very integral to being able to obtain great future jobs. Let's watch this quick video from the History Channel about the Little Rock Nine. Keep in mind what their experience was like. How would you describe that?
Moment, an event that forever altered the course of race relations in America. As our image reveals itself, the 1957 school year is about to begin, and an angry mob is trying to stop 9 Black students from entering Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas.
question I usually get asked is, were we scared? I think initially we didn't anticipate clearly all of the violence and turmoil that occurred. The first day that we attempted to go to school, 8 of us were at one part of the school, and Elizabeth Eckford was at another part. And it was the mob that followed Elizabeth. Then you begin to feel that this was a very hostile, violent group of people. Even at that point, I told myself if we didn't go through with it, didn't attend Central and backed out, it would just reinforce the view that the African American community in Little Rock wasn't interested in making a change.
During the 1950s, African Americans throughout the country were trying to make their voices heard.
We, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, do now and will continue to carry on our mass protest.
The driver demanded that I give this seat up to a white man. I didn't feel that I was being treated as a human being. I refused to give up this seat. I said no.
Little Rock was a year after the Montgomery bus boycott. So we had seen the impact of Rosa Parks and the beginning of Dr. King's career, and knew that things could change.
All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet.
The first step for the Little Rock Nine came in May 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued its opinion in the landmark case Brown versus the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. Separate but equal was inherently unequal, and integration was now the law of the land. In 1957, this decision and the power of the federal government were tested in Little Rock, Arkansas.
We didn't, at the moment we were selected, have any idea it was going to be as difficult as it turned out to be.
In the face of protests at Central High School, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, calls out the National Guard. His official reasoning is to preserve the peace and prevent violence.
It clearly wasn't to protect us. It was to make a symbolic stand. It was to protect the way of life in the South, because they barred our entrance.
Hoping to throw open these school doors, President Dwight Eisenhower does the unprecedented. He calls in the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army.
I think President Eisenhower wanted to show that the federal government was supreme in this. And they could have done what they needed to do with 100 troops. But 1,000 paratroopers was really meant to send a message.
Under the guard of the U.S. Army, the students are finally able to do something seemingly very simple: go to school. But it would not be easy for Ernest Green or his 8 fellow black students.
School was like going to war every day. The walks from class to class were where, you had a lot of harassment, a lot of physical violence.
But Ernest Green persevered, becoming the first black graduate of Central High School with the class of 1958. Green would eventually go on to a successful banking career and government service in the Carter administration. But in 1958, integration was not complete in Little Rock. The following year, Governor Faubus closed all public schools in Arkansas instead of complying with desegregation. Schools in Arkansas would not be fully integrated until 1972. Yet, the world would always remember these 9 students who, by claiming their place in the classroom, were claiming their place in history.
Attending Central was special in the sense that it was part of history. It was part of a change. This was reverberating all over the country, all over the world.
Ernest Ernest Green wasn't the only member of the Little Rock Nine to make a name for himself. What happened to the rest? Well, one's a magazine publisher, another a social worker. There's also a teacher, a realtor, 2 writers, an accountant, and a clinical psychologist. Seems they did pretty well, all things being equal. For the History Channel, I'm Mike Rowe.
All right, there is a little information about the Little Rock Nine. If you were living in this time period, do you think you would have been brave enough to be one of the first to attend a desegregated school? Why or why not? It's kind of a personal reflection question, so I'll skip that one here. Lots of those in this slideshow. As desegregation continued, the membership of the KKK grew. What was the KKK? It was a white supremacist group really focused on preventing allowing African American people to vote. They used violence or threats against anyone who was suspected of favoring desegregation for African American civil rights. The Ku Klux Klan terror included intimidation and murder. It was widespread in the South during the 1950s and 60s through Klan activities, though Klan activities were not always reported in the media. Despite threats and violence, the civil rights movement quickly moved beyond school desegregation to challenge segregation in other areas. In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a member of the Montgomery, Alabama branch of the NAACP, was told to give up her seat on a city bus to a white person. When Parks refused to move, she was arrested. Excuse me. The local NAACP, led by Edgar D. Nixon, recognized that the arrest of Parks might rally local African American people to protest segregated buses. Who would be negatively impacted by a bus boycott? The bus companies, of course, and the people doing the protesting, because they would have to walk or find another way to get to where they needed to go, which would be very inconvenient, but they were willing to do it. Montgomery's African American community had long been angry about their mistreatment on city buses, where white drivers were rude and abusive. The community had previously considered a boycott of the buses, and overnight one was organized. The bus boycott was an immediate success, with almost unanimous support from the African American people in Montgomery. The boycott lasted for more than a year, expressing to the nation the determination of African American people in the South to end segregation. How would people get where they needed to go without a bus? Unfortunately, they would probably be walking. Perhaps some would have a car they could carpool with some who were willing to help organize the effort. In November 1956, a federal court ordered Montgomery's buses desegregated, and the boycott ended in victory. Well, looks like this video has an error, so unfortunately we will skip this video about the Montgomery bus boycott. We were able to get all of the information that we needed from those slides. That would have just been a little bit more engaging. Under what circumstances would you be willing to boycott a product or service that you currently use daily? It's a personal reflection question, so we will skip. Just make sure you're thinking about these on your own. A Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. was president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the organization that directed the boycott. His involvement in the protest made him a national figure. Through his eloquent appeals to Christian brotherhood and American idealism, he attracted people both inside and outside the South. King became the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, when it was founded in 1957. The SCLC complemented the NAACP's legal strategy by encouraging the use of nonviolent direct action to protest segregation. These activities included marches, demonstrations, and boycotts. The harsh white response to African American people's direct action eventually forced the federal government to confront the issue of racism in the South. What else do you all know about Martin Luther King? We'll talk about him a little bit more in the next few days. All right, so the activity for today is largely an in-class activity. At least this part of it is. So I'm not going to go over these directions here because if you are absent, you'll be excused from this one. Our exit ticket for today is, was the civil rights movement successful in obtaining equality for all? Why do you say that? And this is going to be a discussion board, so I'd like you to respond to one other person, adding evidence if you agree, or using refuting evidence if you disagree. Thank you all so much for listening. Hope you learned something and enjoyed. Thank you.